He walked into La Fontaine like the room had been arranged for him. Slow, deliberate steps, a laugh that filled the corners before he even sat. Leonard Grayson moved through the dining room with the ease of someone who never needed to apologize, a man whose money had taught him to expect silence and applause in equal measure. When his eyes found Deborah, an apron, a name tag, a small, steady presence carrying plates, his smirk settled into something colder than curiosity. He liked to make people small for sport. That night he wanted a show. Deborah had learned early how to live in two worlds. By the shift, she was a server, practical shoes, practiced smile, the polite tilt of her head that smoothed the ripples of other people's evenings. Outside work, under a bare bulb at home, or on a battered upright that smelled faintly of dust and detergent, she was a pianist who listened for the spaces between notes. Music had been her refuge long before it felt like a goal. Her mother, working double shifts, folding hospital linens at dawn, had given her the kind of steady courage that can't be taught, only inherited. Deborah carried that courage like a quiet jewel in her chest. She kept it hidden most nights, saving it for the truth of the keys. La Fontaine on a Friday was warm with orderly indulgence, stemware chiming, servers murmuring, conversations moving like a placid current. The grand piano in the corner was part of the room's promise, an element of taste and background music, not a stage for defiance. Deborah moved through the restaurant as she always did, a small island of composure. She noticed Leonard the way you notice a storm rolling in, a change in temperature you can't ignore. He singled her out with a cruel sort of ease. "Deborah," he called, the name a small knife. "What else do you do besides carry plates? Don't you have a hidden talent somewhere?" His voice threaded the room. The men at his table laughed. Heads turned. The request might have been harmless if it had been asked gently, but Leonard made spectacle into entertainment. He expected the embarrassed laugh, the dutiful performance that reassured him his power still worked. She could have said no. She could have told him this was a restaurant, not a stage. But something, stubbornness, memory, the echo of her mother's voice, nudged her toward the piano. Maybe she wanted to prove something to herself. Maybe she recognized the thin line between being unseen and refusing to be invisible. Whatever the reason, she stood and walked across the floor, each step measured, each breath collected like a brace for impact. The piano felt larger when she sat down. The chandelier spilled a soft halo over the lacquered wood. The keys glinted like a challenge. The room exhaled a private, anticipatory hush. Deborah placed her hands on the ivory and let the first notes fall like rain, soft, careful, a small sound meant to test the air. She began not with spectacle, but with truth. A melody that threaded sorrow into hope, a phrase that carried the small rooms of her childhood and the late-night practices she had stolen between shifts. Her playing was not designed to shock. It was the honest articulation of a life practiced in private. The sound moved through the restaurant and rearranged people inside it. Conversations stilled. Napkins halted mid-fold. Leonard's laugh tapered into silence as the music opened a space he had not considered, an intimacy he could not buy. There is a peculiar violence in being asked to perform for someone's amusement. You are asked to show your vulnerability so they can feel larger by comparison. Deborah felt that pressure, and she felt, too, an answer rising in her fingers. She did not play to humiliate. She played to be known. She let her phrasing breathe, let a bluesy cut edge into the melody, let her left hand hold down the pulse of the life she had led. Work, small victories, the stubborn refusal to give up practice. Each chord was a sentence, each cadence a small confession. The music told the room who she was, in a way her apron never could. The transformation was subtle at first, the way a table of four went quiet, the way a couple at the bar leaned forward, the way a server paused with a tray. And then it widened. People began to clap, tentative, then sincere. Her colleagues, who had seen her slip into the back room to practice, watched with a fierce tenderness that looked like pride. The applause swelled until it caught Deborah by surprise. She sat a moment, hands resting on the keys, feeling the room's warmth wash over a truth she had hoarded for years. Leonard clapped too, but his clap was the sound of a man searching for his footing. He tried to reclaim the evening with a joke, a small concession that read like an attempt at magnanimity. Charm disguised as benevolence. "Talent comes from the most surprising places," he said, voice attempting lightness. It landed flat. For the first time that night, his companions looked unsure. The smirk that had been part of his armor had been polished away by something it could not blunt, the clarity of Deborah's making. She answered him not with triumph, but with a calm trueness. "Everyone has a gift," she said. "It's how you use it that matters." There was no victory pose, no gloating. Her voice was the same steady thing it had been behind the counter, polite, measured, but now carrying the added weight of someone who had shown she would not be conscripted into someone else's entertainment. After she returned to her station, the air had shifted. Guests lingered to compliment her. Some asked how to follow her music. A few left tips that would mean the difference between taking a lesson this month or not. One man, perhaps the unlikeliest witness to the night's change, tapped her shoulder and whispered, "You should play more." Deborah smiled in a way that was both surprised and familiar, the startled gratitude of someone who has been unexpectedly seen. Word moves differently than it used to. Now it moves on phones and in shared videos. A patron's shaky clip of her playing, filmed from a corner table, found a small audience online. People commented, praise, curiosity, the kind of messages that make a person feel both visible and vulnerable. Among them was a message from a modest Nashville producer who had been in town for business and found himself reluctant to leave the room that night. He offered a studio session, not a contract or a headline, just a room, a microphone, and the chance to make a record of her voice. Offers arrived like small doors opening. Deborah accepted the studio session because she had learned the difference between a lifeline and an illusion. This was not a promise of overnight fame. It was a chance to do the work that her talent deserved. She booked lessons, she practiced with renewed rigor, and she kept working at La Fontaine because the world rarely grants neat transitions. The nights at the restaurant were still nights of plates and polite smiles, but now her sleeves carried a different light. Her shoulders felt a little less burdened. Leonard left that night with something like a bruise to his pride. He had expected to be the center of a story that confirmed his appetite for spectacle. Instead, he had been witness to a quiet dismantling of the script he had written for himself. For a fleeting time after he left, he rehearsed a version of the evening that softened his culpability. He had only wanted to be entertained. He had only meant to joke. But the image of Deborah's steady hands on the keys followed him in the margins of other nights. It did not shame him out loud. No dramatic comeuppance arrived, but a small recalibration had occurred. He had been seen, and in being seen, he had been required for a moment to recognize someone else's humanity. The real change, the one that mattered most, was less cinematic and more durable. Deborah's music became a small gravity in her life. It pulled opportunities that were incremental and real. She recorded a demo that did not promise stardom, but did open conversations with people who wanted to hear more. She played small shows in venues that paid modestly, but listened more closely. Each step was a careful accumulation. The kitchen manager who had once scheduled her on the busiest Friday nights now left room in the roster for a set. Customers began to arrive on certain evenings hoping to hear her play, and beyond that, something happened to the room itself. La Fontaine learned to be a place where a server could be an artist and not merely optional entertainment. The staff began to carry a different respect for one another. The patrons, a different readiness to listen. Not everyone changed, of course. Leonard returned to his orbit of privilege, but with a slightly altered cadence. He remained who he was, but the echo of that night had taught him, at least, not to assume. Deborah carried the evening with a modest pride that did not need to be announced. She had not sought to humiliate. She had simply refused to be humiliated. She had turned a public attempt to objectify her into a public reminder. Talent is not a spectacle to be used at whim. It is a person's life, and it deserves to be treated as such. Months later, when she sat in the small studio and listened to the playback of a song she had recorded, raw, imperfect, and honest, she felt something settle inside her like a new, quieter courage. The notes were the same she had always played, but now they had a provenance. They were not secret anymore. They had been offered into the world and found a way back to her, carried by people who had listened. It is tempting to tell a tidy moral, arrogance punished, talent rewarded. But life is rarely that clean. Leonard's humiliation did not make him a villain in a storybook. He simply lost a certainty he had relied on. Deborah did not become an overnight sensation. She became an artist with a steadier path. The true victory was quieter, a rearrangement of attention, a small rewrite in how people treated each other. In the end, the power of the night was not that one man was silenced and another applauded. It was that a woman who had been asked to perform for someone else's amusement decided, on her own terms, to reveal her truth. The music she played was not a weapon. It was an invitation. It asked listeners to remember that everyone, the person who brings your plate, the one who occupies an unassuming corner of your life, has a story, a craft, a dignity. And when that dignity is finally acknowledged, the whole room is changed.